Johnny Appleseed, a pioneer hero. The far west is rapidly becoming the only traditional destination railroads have destroyed the romance of frontier life, or have surrounded it with many appliances of civilization, but the pioneer character is rapidly becoming mythical. The men and women who obtain their groceries and dry goods from New York by rail in a few hours have nothing in common with those who, 50 years ago, packed salt in hundreds of miles to make their mush pliable, and could only exchange corn and wheat for molasses and calico for making long and perilous voyages in flatboats down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers to New Orleans. Two generations of frontier lives have accumulated stores of narratives which, like those of the beautiful tributaries of great rivers, are forgotten in the broad sweep of the larger current of history. The march of titans sometimes tramples out the memory of smaller but more useful lives, and sensational glare often eclipses more modest and purer lights. This has been the case in the popular demand of the dime novel delusions of Fenimore Cooper's romances of border life, which have preserved the records of Indian rapine and atrocity as the only memorials of pioneer history. But the early days of the Western settlement witnessed similar heroisms to those of human torture, nobler victories of those of tomahawk and scalping knife. Among the heroes of endurance that was voluntary and of the action that was creative and not sanguinary, there was one man whose name, seldom mentioned, now saved by some of the few surviving pioneers, deserves to be perpetuated. The first reliable trace of our modest hero finds him in the territory of Ohio in 1801 with a horse load of apple seeds, where he planted in various places and about the borders of Licking Creek. The first orchard thus originated by him being in the farm of Isaac Staton, and what is now known as Licking Country, in the old state of Ohio. During the 5 succeeding years, although he was undoubtedly following a strange occupation, we have no authentic account of his movements until we reach a pleasant spring day in 1806, when a pioneer settler in Jefferson County, Ohio, noticed a peculiar craft with a remarkable occupant and curious cargo slowly dropping down with the current of the Ohio River. It was Johnny Appleseed, by the name of which Johnny Chapman was afterward known in every log cabin in the Ohio River to the northern lakes, and westward to the prairies of what is now the state of Indiana. With two canoes lashed together, he was transporting a load of apple seeds to the western frontier for the purpose of creating orchards in the furthest verge of the white settlements. With his canoes, he passed down the Ohio to the Marietta, where he entered the Muskingum, ascending the stream of that river until it reached the mouth of the Wohonding, or White Woman Creek, and still onward up the Mohican and to the Black Fork to the head of the navigation, in the region known as Ashland and Richland counties, on the line of Pittsburgh and Fort Wayne Railroad in Ohio. A long and toilsome voyage it was, as a glance of a map will show, and must have occupied a great deal of time, as the lonely traveler stopped at every inviting spot to plant the seeds and make his infant nurseries. These are the first well-authenticated facts of the history of Jonathan Chapman, whose birth, there is a good reason for believing, occurred in Boston, Massachusetts in 1775. According to this, which was his own statement in one of the less reticent moods, he was at the time in the appearance of Licking Creek 26 years of age, and whether impelled by his eccentricities by some absolute misery of the heart which would only find relief in the incessant motion, or governed by a benevolent monomania, his whole afterlife was devoted to the work of planted apple seeds in remote places. The seeds he gathered from cider presses in western Pennsylvania, his canoe voyage of 1806 appears to have been the only occasion upon which he adapted the method of transporting them, and all his subsequent journeys were made on foot. Having planted his stock of seeds, he returned to Pennsylvania for a fresh supply, and the sacks made any less substantial fabric would not endure the hard usage in the long trip through dense forests, underbrush, and briars, when he provided himself with leathern bags. Securely packed, the seeds were conveyed, sometimes on the back of a horse, and not unfortunately on his own shoulders, either over park or the old Indian trail that led from Fort Deschutes Detroit, by way of Fort Sandusky, over what's styled in the appendix to Hutchison's History of Bowcat's Expedition 1764, the second route through the wilderness of Ohio, which would require him to traverse a distance of 166 miles in the west-northwest direction from Fort Duquesne in order to reach the Black Fork of the Mohegan. This region, although it is now densely populated, still possesses a romantic beauty that railroads and bustling towns cannot obliterate. The country is forest-clad hills and green valleys, through which numerous bright streams flow on their way to the Ohio. But when Johnny Appleseed reached some lonely log cabin, he would find himself in a veritable wilderness. The old settlers say that the margins of the streams, which the first settlements generally made, were thickly covered with low matted growth of small timber, while nearer to the water was rank mass of long grass interlaced with morning glory wild pea vines, among which funeral willows and clustering adders stood like sentinels of the outposts of civilization. The hills that rise almost to the dignity of the mountains were crowned with forest trees, while in the coverts were innumerable bears, wolves, deer, and droves of wild hogs that were as ferocious as any beast of prey. And the grass of the Masagna and other venomous reptiles lurked in such numbers that the settler named Chandler has left the fact on record that during the first season of his residence, while mowing a little prairie which formed part of his land, he killed over 200 black rattlesnakes in the area that would involve an average destruction of one of these reptiles for each rod of land. A frontiersman who felt himself sufficiently protected by his rifle against wild beasts and hostile Indians found it necessary to guard against the attacks of insidious enemies in the grass by wrapping bandages of dried grass around his buckskin leggings and moccasins. But Johnny would shoulder his bag of apple seeds and with bare feet penetrate to some remote spot that combined picturesque and fertility of soil, and there he would plant his seeds and place a slight enclosure around the place, and leave them to grow until trees were large enough to have been transplanted by the settlers, who, in the meantime, would have made their clearings in the vicinity. The sites chosen by him are, many of them, well known, and are such that an artist or poet would select open places on the loamy lands that border the creeks, rich, secluded spots hemmed in by giant trees, picturesque now, but 50 years ago, with their wild surroundings and their primal silence, they must have been tenfold more so. In personal appearance, Chapman was a small, wiry man, full of restless activity. He had long black hair, a scanty beard that was never shaved, and keen black eyes that sparkled with a peculiar brightness. His dress was the oddest description. Generally, even in the coldest weather, he went barefoot, but sometimes for his long journeys he would make himself a rude pair of sandals, and other times he would wear any cast-off foot covering he chanced to find. A boot on one foot and an old brogan or moccasin on the other. It appears to have been a matter of conscience with him never to purchase shoes, although he was rarely without money enough to do so. On one occasion, it was unusually cold November. While he was traveling barefooted through mud and snow, a settler who happened to possess a pair of shoes that were too small for his own forced their acceptance on Johnny, declaring that it was sinful for a human being to travel with naked feet in such weather. A few days afterward, the donor was in the village that since became a thriving city in Mansfield, and met his beneficiary contentedly plodding along with his bare foot and half frozen. With some degree of anger, he inquired for the cause of such foolish conduct, and received a reply that Johnny had overtaken a poor barefooted family moving westward, and they appeared to be in much greater need of clothing than he was, and he had given them the shoes. His dress was generally composed of cast-off clothing that he had taken in payment for apple trees, as the pioneers were far less extravagant than their descendants in such matters. The homespun and buckskin garments that they discarded would not be very elegant or serviceable. In his later years, however, he seems to have thought that even this kind of second-hand raiment was too luxurious, as his principal garment was made of a coffee sack, in which he cut holes for his head and arms to pass through, and pronounced it as a very serviceable cloak, and as good clothing as any man need wear. In the matter of headgear, his taste was equally unique. His first experiment was with a tin vessel that served as a cook for his mush. But this was open to objectification that it did not protect his eyes from the beams of the sun. So he constructed a hat of pasteboard with an immense peak in front, and thus having secured the article of combined usefulness with economy, it became his permanent fashion. Thus, strangely clad, he was perpetually wandering through the forests and morasses, and suddenly appearing in white settlements and Indian villages. But there must have been some rare force of gentle goodness dwelling in his looks and breathing his words, for it is a testimony of all who knew him, notwithstanding his ridiculous attire. He was always treated with the greatest respect by the rudest frontiersmen, and, what is a better test, the boys of the settlements forbore to cheer him. With grown-up people and boys, he was usually reticent. He manifested great affection for the little girls, always having pieces of ribbon or gay calico to give his little favorites. Many a grandmother in Ohio and Indiana can remember the presents she first received as a child from poor homeless Johnny Appleseed. When he consented to eat with any family, he would never sit down on the table until he was sure that there was an ample supply for the children. And his sympathy for their youthful troubles and his kindness toward them made him friends among the juveniles of the borders. The Indians also treated Johnny with the greatest kindness. By these wild and sanguinary satives, he was regarded as a great medicine man on account for his strange appearance, eccentric actions, and especially the fortitude with which he could endure pain, in proof of which he would often thrust pins and needles into his flesh. His nervous sensibilities really seem to have been less acute than those of ordinary people, for his method of treating the cuts and sores that were the consequences of his barefoot wanderings through briars and thorns was to sear the wound with a red-hot iron and then cure the burn. During the War of 1812, when the frontier settlers were tortured and slaughtered by the savage allies of Great Britain, Johnny Appleseed considered his wanderings and was never harmed by the roving bands of hostile Indians. On many occasions, the impunity with which he ranged the country enabled him to give settlers warning of approaching danger and time to allow them to take refuge in their blockhouses before the savages could attack them. Our informant refers to one of these instances when the news of Hull's surrender came like a thunderbolt upon the frontier. Large bands of Indians and British were destroying everything before them, murdering defenseless women and children, and even blockhouses were not always a sufficient protection. At this time, Johnny traveled day and night, warning the people of approaching danger. He visited every cabin and delivered this message. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, and he has anointed me to blow the trumpet in the wilderness and sound the alarm in the forest. For behold, the tribes of the heathen are round your doors, and devouring flame followeth after them. The aged man who narrated this incident said that he could feel even now the thrill that was caused by the prophetic announcement and the wild-looking herald of danger, who will rouse a family on the bright moonlit night with his piercing voice. Refusing all offers of food and denying himself a moment's rest, he traversed the border day and night until he had warned every settler of the approaching peril. His diet was as meager as his clothing. He believed it to be a sin to kill any creature for food, and thought it was necessary for human sustenance was produced by the soil. He was also a stupendous opponent of the waste of food, and on one occasion, approaching a log cabin, he observed some fragments of bread floating upon the surface of a bucket of slops that was intended for the pigs. He immediately fished them out, and then the housewife expressed her astonishment, and he told her that it was the abuse of the gifts of a merciful God to allow the smallest quantity of anything that was designed to supply the wants of mankind to be diverted from its purpose. In this instance, as in his whole life, his peculiar religious ideas of Johnny Appleseed were exemplified. He was the most earnest disciple of the faith taught by Emmanuel Swedenborg, who himself claimed to have frequent conversations with angels and spirits. Two of the latter, of the feminine gender, he assented, had revealed to him that they were to be wives of a future state if he abstained from matrimonial alliance on the earth. He entertained a profound reverence for his revelations of the Swedish seer, and always carried a few volumes with him. There he was very anxious she should read by everyone, and he probably was not the only keeper of the wilderness of Ohio, but as he had no tract society to furnish him supplies, he certainly devised an original method of multiplying one book into a number. He divided his books into several pieces, leaving a portion of the log cabin and subsequent visit furnishing another fragment, and continuing his process as diligently as though the work had been published in serial numbers. By this plan, he was able to furnish reading for several people at the same time out of one book. But it must have been a difficult undertaking for some nearly illiterate backwoodsman to endeavor to comprehend Swedenborg or the backward course of reading. When the first installment appeared, he had the last fraction of the volume. Johnny's faith in Swedenborg's works was so reverential as almost to be superstitious. He was once asked if traveling barefooted through the forests abounding with venomous reptiles, he was not afraid of being bitten. With his peculiar smile, he drew his book from his bosom and said, "This book is an infallible protection against all danger here and hereafter." It was his custom, when he had been welcomed into some hospitable log house after a weary day of journeying, to lie down on the puncheon floor, and after inquiring if his auditors would hear some news brought from heaven, produce his few tattered books, among which were the New Testament, and read and expound until his uncultivated hearers would catch the spirit and glow in his enthusiasm, while they scarcely comprehended his language. The lady who knew him in his later years writes the following terms of one of the domiciliary readings of Poor's sacrificing Johnny Appleseed. "We can hear him read now, just as he did that summer day, when we were busy putting upstairs, and he lay near the door, his voice rising denunciatory and thrilling, strong and loud as a roar of wind and waves, and soft and soothingly as the balmy airs that quivered in the morning glory leaves around his gray beard. He was a strange eloquence at times, and he was undoubtedly a man of genius." What a scene presented to our imagination! The interior of a primitive cabin, the wide, open fireplace, a few sticks are burning beneath the iron pot which the evening meal was cooking. Around the fireplace, an attentive group, composed of the sturdier pioneer and his wife and children, listening to a reverential awe to the news right fresh from heaven. And reclining on the floor, clad in rags, but with his gray hairs glorified in the beams of the setting sun that fled through the open door, and the unchinked logs of the humble building, this poor wanderer, with the gift of genius and eloquence, who believes with the faith of the apostles and martyrs that God has appointed him on a mission of wilderness to preach the gospel of love, to plant apple seeds, and shall produce orchards for the benefit of men and women and little children whom he has never seen. If there is a sublimer faith or a more genuine eloquence in richly decorated cathedrals and under-brocade investments, it would be worth a long journey to find it. Next to his advocacy of his peculiar religious ideas, his enthusiasm for the cultivation of apple trees in what he termed the only proper way, that is, from the seed, was the absorbing object of his life. Upon this, as upon religion, he was eloquent in his appeals. He would describe the growing and ripening fruit of such a rare and beautiful gift of the Almighty with words that became pictures, till his hearers could almost see the manifold forms of beauty present before them. In his eloquence on the subject, as well as his actual labors in planting nurseries, the country over which he traveled for so many years was largely indebted to its numerous orchards. But he denounced the absolute wickedness of all the vices of pruning and grafting, and he would speak to the act of cutting a tree as if it were cruel inflicting upon a sentient being. Not only is he entitled to the fame of being the earliest cultivator of the frontiers, but in the work of protecting animals from abuse and suffering, he proceeded, while in his smaller field he equaled the zeal of good Mr. Burke. Whenever Johnny saw an apple abused or heard of it, he would purchase it and give it to the more humane settler, on condition that it would be kindly treated and properly cared for. It frequently happened that the long journey into the wilderness was caused a few settlers to be encumbered with the lame or broken-down horses, but were turned loose to die. In the autumn, Johnny would make such a diligent search for such animals. Gathering them up, he would bargain for their food and shelter until next spring. Then he would lead them away to a good pasture for the summer. If they recovered so as capable of working, he would never sell them. He would lend them or give them away, stipulating for their good usage. His conception of an absolute sin of inflicting pain or death upon any creature was not limited to the higher forms of animal life, but everything that had being to him, in the fact of its life, endowed with such divine essence that to never destroy it was to inflict an injury upon some atom of divinity. No Brahmin could be more concerned for the preservation of insect life, and the only occasion in which he destroyed a venomous reptile was a source of long regret, to which he never referred without manifesting sadness. He had elected a suitable place for planting apple trees on a small prairie, and in order to prepare the ground, he was mowing the long grass, and he was bitten by a rattlesnake. Describing the event, he sighed heavily and said, "Poor fellow, he only just touched me, when I, in the heat of my ungodly passion, put the heel of my scythe into him," and went away. Some time afterward I went back, and there lay the poor fellow dead. Numerous anecdotes bearing upon his respect for every form of life are preserved, and form the staple of pioneer reflections. On one occasion, a cool autumnal night, Johnny, who always camped in preference of sleeping in a house, had built a fire near he intended to pass the night. He noticed that the blaze attracted large numbers of mosquitoes, many of whom flew too near the fire and burned. He immediately brought water and quenched the fire, accounting for his conduct afterwards, saying, "God forbid that I should build a fire for my comfort, which should be the means of destroying any of its creatures." At another time, he removed the fire he had built near a hollow log and slept in the snow, because he found that the log contained a bear and her cubs, whom he said he did not wish to disturb. And this unwillingness to inflict pain was equally strong when he was a sufferer of it, as the following will show. Johnny had been assisting some settlers to make a road to the woods, and in the course of their work they accidentally destroyed a hornet's nest. One of the angry insects soon found a lodgment under Johnny's coffee sack cloak, and although it stung him repeatedly, he removed it with the greatest gentleness. The men who were present laughingly asked him why he did not kill it, to which he gravely replied, "It would not be right to kill the poor thing, for it did not intend to hurt me." Theoretically, he was as methodical in matters of business as any merchant. In addition to their picturesqueness, the locations of his nurseries were all fixed with a view of the probable demand for the trees by the time they had attained sufficient growth for transplanting. He would give them away to those who could not pay for them. Generally, however, he sold them for clothing or supply of meal for them, but he preferred to receive a note payable at some indefinite period. When this was accomplished, he seemed to think of the transaction as completely business-like. But if the giver of the note did not attend to his payments, the holder of it never troubled himself about its collection. His expenses for food and clothing were so very limited that, notwithstanding his freedom in the Sac James, he was frequently in possession of more money than he cared to keep. It was quickly disposed of for wintering infirm horses, or given to some poor family whom the ague had prostrated, and the accidents of border life had perished. In a single instance only, he is known to have invested his surplus means in the purchase of land, having received a deed from Alexander Findlay of Mohawken Township, Ashland County, Ohio, for a part of the southwest quarter of the section of 26. But with his customary indifference in matters of value, Johnny failed to record the deed and lost it. Only a few years ago, the property was in litigation. We must not leave the reader under the impression that this man's life, so full of hardship and perils, was a gloomy or unhappy one. There is an element of human pride in all martyrdom, which, if it does not soften the pains, stimulates a power of endurance. Johnny's life was made serenely happy by the conviction that he was living like the primitive Christians. Nor was he devoid of a keen humor, to which he occasionally gave vent, as following show. Toward the latter part of Johnny's career in Ohio, an itinerary missionary found his way into the village of Mansfield and preached to an open-air congregation. The discourse was tediously lengthy and necessarily severe on the sin of extravagance, which was beginning to manifest itself among the pioneers by the occasional indulgence of carnal varieties of calico and store tea. There was a good deal of pharisaic living on the preacher, who was frequently emphasized his discourse by the inquiry, "Where now is a man who, like the primitive Christians, is traveling to heaven barefooted and clad in coarse raiment?" When this interrogation had been repeated beyond all reasonable endurance, Johnny rose from the log on which he was reclining, and advanced to the speaker. He placed one of his bare feet on the stump which serves as pulpit, and pointing to his coffee-sack garment, he quietly said, "Well, here's a primitive Christian. The well-clothed missionary hesitated and stammered and dismissed the congregation. His pet antithesis was destroyed by Johnny's personal appearance, which was far more primitive than the preacher cared to copy. Some of the pioneers were disposed to think that Johnny's humor was the cause of extensive practical jokes, but it is generally conceded now that the widespread annoyance was really the result of his belief that the offensively odoured weed known in the West, dog fingal, but more generally styled mayweed, possessed valuable anti-malarial virtues. He procured some seeds from plants in Pennsylvania and sowed them in the vicinity of every house in the region of his travels. The consequence was the successive flourishing of crops of weeds spread over the whole county, and caused almost as much trouble as the disease it was intended to ward off. To this day, dog kennel, introduced by Johnny Appleseed, is one of the worst grievances of the Ohio farmers. In 1838, 37 years after his appearance on Licking Creek, Johnny noticed that civilization, wealth, and population were pressing into the wilderness of Ohio. Hitherto, he had kept easy in his advance in the way of settlement, but now towns and churches were making their appearance, and even at long intervals, the stage driver's horn broke on the silence of the grand old forests, and he felt that his work was done in the region in which he had labored so long. He visited every house and took a solemn farewell of all the families. The little girls who had been delighted by the gifts and fragments of calico and ribbons had become the sober matrons, and the boys who had wandered with the ability to bear the pain caused by running needles into his flesh were heads of families. With parting words of admonition, he left them and turned his steps steadily toward the setting sun. During the succeeding 9 years, he pursued his eccentric avocation to the western border of Ohio and Indiana. In the summer of 1847, when his labors had literally borne the fruit of over 100,000 square miles of territory, at the close of a warm day, after traveling 20 miles, he entered the house of a settler in Allen County, Indiana, and was, as usual, warmly welcomed. He declined to eat with the family, but accepted some bread and milk, which he partook in sitting on the doorstep and gazing on the setting sun. Later in the evening, he delivered his news right fresh from heaven, reading the beach lights. Declining other accommodations, he slept, as usual, on the floor. In the early morning, he was found with his features all aglow with supernatural light, his body so near death that his tongue refused the office. A physician who was hastily summoned pronounced him dying, and added that he had never seen a man in so placid state of approaching death. At 72 years of age, 46 of which had been devoted to self-imposed mission, he ripened into death as natural and beautiful as the seeds of his own planting growth into fiber and bud and blossom of nature's fruit. Thus died one of the memorable men of pioneer times, who never inflicted pain or knew an enemy, a man of strange habits, in whom there dwelt a comprehension and love have reached with one hand downward to the lowest forms of life, and with the other upward to the very throne of God. The laboring, self-denying benefactor of his race, homeless, solitary, and ragged, he trod the thorny earth with bare and bleeding feet, intent only upon making the wilderness fruitful. Now no man knoweth of his sojourn, but his deeds will live in the fragrance of the apple blossoms he has loved so well, and the story of his life, however crudely narrated, will be a perpetual proof that true heroism, pure benevolence, and noble virtues and deeds that deserve immortality may be found under the meanest apparel, far from the gilded halls and towering spires.